The woods were silent that morning, not in a peaceful way, but like something had been ripped from the earth, and even nature refused to speak of it. Some stories haunt the headlines for a few days, and then there are those that never quite fade, cases that claw their way back into public memory, each time revealing a darker layer, a new, unanswered question. This is one of those stories. Welcome to Beneath the Surface, where we dive into the twisted, the forgotten, and the unresolved. Our mission is simple: to explore the dark side of crime, where human nature, fear, and truth collide in the shadows. Today's case takes us deep into the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky, to a forgotten stretch of farmland known to locals as Silent Acres. In 2003, the Harrington family, 6 members strong, vanished from their quiet homestead in a manner so brutal, so baffling, that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. When the bodies were discovered days later, hidden throughout their own home and barn, one thing became clear. This was no robbery, no accident, and no random act of violence. Someone had watched them, waited, and when the time was right, acted with cold, deliberate brutality. In the months that followed, every trail grew colder. Every theory brought more questions. And in the years since, the murder of the Harringtons has become a legend soaked in dread. A rural ghost story with no ending, no closure, and no justice. But legends are often built on truth. And when you start peeling back the layers, listening to old voicemails, reading torn journal entries, interviewing locals who still refuse to say too much, you find things, not just facts, but something more chilling, something beneath the surface. Because this wasn't just a family slaughtered in the woods. It was a story of tension, secrets, and a long simmering dread that no one outside that farmhouse could truly understand. Not until it was far too late. In this investigation, we'll explore the final days of the Harringtons. We'll trace the steps that led to their deaths, from eerie signs of surveillance to cryptic clues left behind. We'll dissect every theory. Was it a vengeful son, a cult, a drifter lost in the woods, or a friend they trusted? Whatever the truth is, it's still out there, waiting. Let's uncover it. This is the Silent Acres Massacre, a descent into one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in modern American history. This is Beneath the Surface, the dark side of crime. There was something different about the Harringtons, not in the obvious town gossip sort of way. If you drove past their property along Route 23, you'd see a neatly kept fence line, an aging but sturdy 2-story farmhouse, and rows of cornfields swaying in the wind. On paper, they were the picture of rural Americana. Self-reliant, hard-working, God-fearing. But ask anyone from the nearby town of Halverton, and you'd get the same quiet shrug, the same polite half-smile followed by, "They kept to themselves." That's how it always starts. The Harrington farm, nicknamed Silent Acres by neighbors, sat on a remote 40-acre plot nestled between the Appalachian hills and a dense patch of pine forest. It was a world apart. No streetlights, no neighbors in sight. Cell service barely scratched the air. It was a place where a family could disappear, and no one would notice for days. The patriarch, Richard Harrington, 56, was a stoic man with the hands of a laborer and the posture of a preacher. Raised in that very house by a father who believed in hard work and silence over softness, Richard carried on the family farm through droughts, debt, and death. His wife, Eliza, 53, was more delicate, though not fragile. Known for her herbal remedies and calm demeanor, she rarely ventured into town, preferring the sanctuary of her garden. They had 2 children. June 29th had left the farm briefly in her early 20s, moved to Tennessee for a year, and returned with a daughter, Clara, and no husband. Her return stirred rumors, but Richard never asked questions in front of others. If he had any disapproval, he buried it beneath layers of discipline and daily chores. Then there was Evan, the youngest, 23 years old, always a little off track. He'd been in and out of juvenile detention as a teen for petty theft and vandalism, but locals said he was mostly harmless. Mostly. He lived in a dilapidated trailer on the edge of the property, still tethered to the family, but always on the fringe. Something about him unsettled people. He didn't make eye contact. He talked to animals. He drank too much. And he'd once been caught digging holes in the woods at night for no reason. And finally, there was Irene Harrington, Richard's mother, 82 years old and barely mobile. She rarely left her room on the second floor. Some said she was senile. Others claimed she still spoke in tongues from her old Pentecostal days. Whatever the truth, she was there, quiet, watching. On the surface, their life was unremarkable. Up at dawn, tending crops, feeding animals, home-cooked meals, Bible readings, a farm routine older than electricity. But underneath, there were fractures. June had confided in her former high school friend, Sarah Miles, that she sometimes heard footsteps in the attic. Not rats, she insisted, something heavier. Richard dismissed it as wind or wildlife. Eliza once told the mailman that their scarecrow had been moved during the night, but again, no one thought much of it. And then there were the reports of lights in the woods. Several times in the months leading up to the murders, neighbors a mile away claimed they saw a soft glow in the tree line behind the Harrington house. Like lanterns or candles, it always disappeared before anyone could get close. A few teenagers even tried to spook themselves with late-night dares, only to find the forest eerily empty and unnaturally quiet. Despite the isolation, the Harringtons had their patterns. Eliza sold jars of honey and herbal salves at the Halverton Farmers Market. June occasionally brought Clara into town for school supplies, though she homeschooled her daughter. Richard stopped by the feed store twice a month. Evan came into town less and less. None of them had any known enemies. But there was something about the land they lived on, about silent acres, that seemed to repel people. The soil grew crops, sure, but it also grew silence, rumors, paranoia. After the murders, one neighbor would tell reporters, "I always thought something wasn't right out there. That farm, it felt watched." Another local, Carl Jennings, who used to do odd jobs for Richard, recalled once seeing a second shadow in the barn while he was working. "Thought it was Evan," he said. But Evan was gone that day. When I looked again, it was gone. The Harringtons never reported anything to the police. Not the footsteps, not the lights, not the fear that had started to grow in the quiet spaces between their days. Whether out of pride, isolation, or disbelief, they handled it themselves. June kept a journal, sporadically filled with entries that began optimistically but became increasingly fragmented in tone. One line, scrawled just 3 weeks before the murders, simply read, "If someone wanted to watch us here, they wouldn't have to try very hard. We're all just waiting to be seen." And in the days before their deaths, the signs became undeniable. The family dog, a loyal mutt named Briscoe, refused to go near the barn. Chickens were slaughtered and left in odd patterns. Eliza told a vendor at the market that she hadn't slept in days. Richard, who rarely spoke out of turn, asked the pastor at church if evil could live in a house. No one knew how to respond. Now, looking back, these moments appear as red flags flapping in the wind. But at the time, they were just quirks. Strange, but ignorable. That's the thing about isolation. It doesn't scream. It whispers. And the Harringtons were listening. But by the time they understood what they were hearing, it was already too late. There's a strange thing that happens in hindsight. The ordinary starts to look like an omen. A conversation becomes a warning. A sound in the dark becomes a prelude. And a week that once felt like any other begins to rot under the weight of what was coming. That's what the Harringtons' final days were like. Mundane, uneventful, until you listen closer. And then the dread starts to seep in. Sunday, March the 23rd, 2003. The Harringtons attended church. All of them, even Evan. It was the first time in months the entire family was seen together in public. Clara, the youngest, wore a blue ribbon in her hair. June looked tired, drawn, pale, eyes flicking toward the windows as if expecting something. According to Pastor Lyle Simmons, Richard lingered after the service, said he needed to talk. He asked strange questions about demonic influence, about how to cleanse a home. Pastor Simmons later told investigators, "I thought he was just tired. He said something about the land feeling heavy. I didn't press. Maybe I should have." That afternoon, Eliza burned sage around the house. She wasn't superstitious, but something had shaken her. Later that night, June wrote in her journal, "The attic again. I heard it. Just one step. Like someone testing the floorboard. I'm not imagining this. I know I'm not." Monday, March 24th. Briscoe, the family dog, refused to come inside the house. Eliza tried to coax him in with food, but he stayed planted near the shed, growling at nothing. Richard checked the attic, again. No one was there, no signs of entry, but one of the small attic windows had been opened. Just a crack. That evening, Evan showed up at the main house. He wanted food, cigarettes, money. A fight broke out, Evan and Richard shouting loud enough for a neighbor to hear through the trees. "You brought something here," Richard was heard yelling. The neighbor, Harold Bixby, would later tell investigators he assumed it was a family spat. Nothing new, but this time, Evan didn't return to his trailer. He disappeared into the woods, muttering to himself. Tuesday, March 25th. Clara told June she saw a man in the barn. June dismissed it at first, but when she checked, she found something odd. The hayloft had been disturbed. Fresh footprints, hay matted down in a rectangular shape, as if someone had been lying there, she told her mother. Eliza insisted it must have been Evan, but June knew better. Evan hadn't come back. That night they locked every door and window. Richard sat on the porch with his shotgun for hours. He didn't come to bed. Wednesday, March 26th. The phone line went dead. They still had a landline. Cell service was useless on the farm. But that morning, when Eliza tried to call the church, nothing. Just silence. Richard walked the line to the edge of the property and found the cable slashed. Not torn, not chewed, cleanly cut. He told no one in town, didn't report it. He fixed what he could and nailed boards across the barn doors. That night, June wrote her final entry in the journal. "Something is wrong with the land. It feels like it's breathing under us, like it wants us gone. If anything happens, please believe me. We were scared. We were so scared." Thursday, March 27th. No one in town saw the Harringtons. They missed their usual supply run to the feed store. Eliza didn't show up at the market. June didn't answer calls from her friend Sarah, but that wasn't uncommon. The Harringtons often stayed on the property for days. Self-sufficient, private. Everyone assumed it was just another quiet spell. But something had changed. That night, 2 hunters reported seeing light in the woods behind the farm. Slow-moving, like someone carrying a lantern. They also heard something. Not voices, not animals. A dull, rhythmic thudding. Metal on wood. Over and over, they thought it was someone chopping firewood. Friday, March 28th. Silence. That was the last day the Harringtons were alive, based on forensic estimates. Saturday, March 29th, Monday, March 31st. The farm sat still. From the road, nothing seemed wrong. Animals grazed quietly. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was stoking the fire. Briscoe was gone. But inside, the house had grown cold, and no one was answering the door. Tuesday, April 1st. Harold Bixby, concerned by the absence of the Harringtons, walked the half-mile from his property to check in. When no one answered the front door, he circled to the barn. What he found would unearth one of the darkest mysteries Appalachia had ever known. It wasn't the smell that hit him first. It was the silence. The kind of silence that soaks the air like a threat. Statement from Harold Bixby. The gravel crunched beneath Harold Bixby's boots as he made his way toward the barn. He'd called out several times. No answer, no movement. Briscoe, the Harringtons' dog, wasn't barking. In fact, Briscoe wasn't anywhere. What struck Harold first was the odd placement of the tools leaning neatly against the barn wall, as if someone had just used them, wiped them clean, and left them in perfect order. He opened the barn door. The first thing he saw was Richard Harrington, lying in the hay near the stall where they kept the goats. His body was twisted unnaturally, face down, head partially caved in. Blood soaked the straw in a wide, sticky halo. Next to him, behind a stack of firewood, was Eliza, slumped over, one arm draped across her lap. Her skull had been split with such force, forensic reports would later say it was unrecognizable. Yet her body had been posed, sitting upright, as if someone wanted her to look like she had simply fallen asleep. Harold ran, not toward town, toward the house. The door was unlocked. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, but embers still smoldered in the ash. A cup of tea sat on the kitchen table, still half full. The table had been set for 6. No sign of a struggle. In the hallway, Irene Harrington was found in her rocking chair, dead. Her hands were folded in her lap, eyes wide open. A single, deep wound above her ear. Her face had been washed. The bedroom down the hall held Clara, just 7 years old. She had been tucked into bed, covers pulled up to her chin, a stuffed rabbit in her arms. She had suffered multiple blows to the head with what would later be identified as a splitting maul, an axe-like farm tool with a blunt end. Across the hall, June Harrington was found next to her bed on the floor, mid-step, as if she had gotten up in the middle of the night, maybe hearing something, and met her killer just outside the doorway. Her journal was open on the nightstand. When police arrived at the scene, the first name they asked about was Evan. He was nowhere to be found. His trailer, just 400 yards into the woods, was empty. Inside, police found liquor bottles, hunting magazines, and a butcher knife drying in the sink. But no signs of struggle. No blood. No weapons. A search was launched immediately. Over the next 72 hours, detectives and forensics swarmed the Harrington property. What they uncovered only deepened the mystery. No signs of forced entry. All doors and windows had been locked or secured from the inside. Whoever entered knew the house or had been let in. The phone line had been deliberately cut. Wires sliced clean, 200 feet from the property near the old hunting path. The attic contained signs of habitation, old sleeping bags, food wrappers, water bottles. Someone had been living up there, possibly for days, maybe longer. There were scratch marks on the wood and a hole carved through the attic floorboards above Clara's room, just wide enough for someone to watch through. The fire had been maintained after the murders. Investigators found ash from at least 2 more nights' worth of logs after the estimated time of death. Food had been eaten. Fresh bread was missing. A plate in the sink tested positive for pork fat and cornmeal. Someone cooked and ate inside the house after the family was dead. The dog, Briscoe, was found alive. He had been locked in the root cellar, covered in scratches, dehydrated, but alive. Who locked him there, and why? A splitting maul, a heavy axe-like tool used for chopping wood, was found in the barn beneath a false floor panel. It matched the dimensions of the wounds on all 6 victims. No fingerprints. No blood on the handle. Clean. Almost as if it had been lovingly wiped down and hidden. News of the massacre spread quickly. Local papers ran headlines like "Family Slain in Sleep" and "The Silent Acres Massacre." National news picked up the story within 48 hours. The town of Halverton turned inward, Suspicion brewed. People stopped answering their doors. Guns were loaded. Locks were changed. Children kept home from school. Rumors spiraled. It was a ritual killing. It was the revenge of a scorned lover. It was Evan, and he was still out there, watching. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came on day 4 of the investigation. Inside the barn, above the stall where Richard had been found, someone had carved a sentence into the wood with what appeared to be a pocket knife. They knew what they buried. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no explanation. We walked in expecting to find a killer. What we found was a story no one wanted to tell. Agent Rebecca Lowe, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. By dawn the next morning, Evan Harrington was the most wanted man in the state of Kentucky. Helicopters hovered above the ridges. Dogs swept through the woods. The FBI was called in due to the brutality and scope of the crime. The Harrington farm was sealed off as a federal crime scene. And yet, Evan had vanished. No credit card activity. No sightings. No footprints leading away from his trailer. It was as if he had evaporated into the trees. Theories spiraled fast. Did Evan kill his entire family in a psychotic break? Was he a scapegoat for something far darker? Or had he been taken by the same force that silenced the rest? FBI profilers flew in from Quantico. Special Agent Rebecca Lowe, who had worked cases from Waco to West Virginia, later told documentary crews that the Silent Acres scene was one of the most methodical she'd ever encountered. This wasn't a rage killing, she said. It was planned, patient, precise. Whoever did this didn't panic. They stayed, they ate, they organized the scene. That single fact, the killer stayed in the house, rattled everyone. For at least 48 hours after the murders, someone fed the animals, maintained the fire, washed dishes, locked the dog in the cellar. It was as if the killer wanted to preserve the illusion that life at Silent Acres was still continuing. A breakthrough came 3 days after the bodies were discovered. A local hunter, Martin Flannery, turned in footage from a motion-triggered trail cam he'd placed near the old deer path behind the Harrington property. The camera had captured a blurry photo at 3:27 a.m. on March 29th, the night after the estimated time of death. In the frame, a tall figure partially obscured by branches carrying what appeared to be a lantern. The figure wore a long coat, no face visible, no obvious features, but in their other hand, a large, blunt object, possibly the splitting maul. It was the only visual evidence investigators would ever get. The second lead, the radio message. On April 4th, a local late-night AM radio station received a call during their open-line segment. The voice was low, deliberate, masked by distortion. He said only one sentence before hanging up. They didn't lock the door. They thought it wouldn't find them. The call was traced to a payphone off Route 7, miles from the Harrington farm. It had been wiped clean. Investigators found June Harrington's journal, the one on her nightstand, increasingly disturbing. Though sporadic, her final entries painted a chilling psychological picture. She wrote of seeing a man with no eyes in the trees, finding boot prints beneath Clara's bedroom window, prints that vanished after 10 steps, repeatedly hearing breathing through the floorboards. A final plea. If we die here, tell them it wasn't ghosts. It was worse than that. It was someone we knew. This entry would become the haunting thesis of the investigation. As days passed with no arrest, Halverton turned inward. People began accusing each other. Grocery store fights broke out. Churches held prayer vigils. One local pastor warned, "This is not just murder. It's evil walking." Kids whispered about the watcher in the barn. Parents threatened to move away. The house became a modern legend overnight. Someone even tried to burn the Harrington home down 2 weeks later. The fire was stopped. Barely. On April 10th, nearly 10 days after the murders, Evan Harrington walked into a ranger station in Pine Rock National Forest, 40 miles away. he was barefoot, covered in scratches, malnourished, speaking in fragments. The only words he repeated clearly were, "I didn't do it. I was hiding. I saw it. I saw it in the woods." When questioned, he couldn't describe what he saw, just shapes, eyes. He said it followed him, but never left prints. He passed a polygraph, but it was inconclusive. He showed signs of trauma, extreme sleep deprivation, and exposure. He was treated at a psychiatric facility for a week, then released under surveillance. The public wanted justice. The FBI wanted more evidence. But they had nothing solid. By June 2003, the Harrington murders officially entered cold case status. There were no new leads, no arrests, no confessions, no physical evidence tying Evan or anyone to the murders. The splitting maul yielded no prints. The attic DNA was mixed and inconclusive. The barn carving, they knew what they buried, could not be linked to any known person, and the Silent Acres farm stood empty, a husk, a monument to unanswered. In 2004, a single white envelope arrived at the Halverton Sheriff's Office. No return address. Inside, a photo. It was the Harrington family, taken from a distance, weeks before the murders. They were on the front porch, smiling, written on the back in black ink. "Smile for the last harvest." Fingerprints, none.DNA ? Inconclusive. Lead, dead. Everyone in Halverton had a theory, and that's what happens when the devil wears a familiar face. Local resident anonymous interview. The Silent Acres massacre was unlike anything the region had ever seen. 6 brutally murdered. No signs of forced entry, no forensic match. And the killer, if they were ever there to begin with, vanished like mist in the hills. As weeks turned into months, the investigation splintered into theories, some grounded in logic, others not so much, all of them terrifying in their own way. From day one, Evan was the obvious suspect, the outcast, the addict, the troubled son. He lived just 400 yards from the crime scene in a decaying trailer. He had a history of outbursts. He'd been in therapy for violent ideation, and the week before the murders he'd fought with Richard, loud enough for neighbors to hear. But the case against him never fully held. No blood was found in his trailer. The murder weapon had no prints. He disappeared during the murders, but reappeared days later in a state of mental collapse, barefoot and starving. When questioned, he claimed he had been hiding in the woods, that he saw something moving near the barn on the night of the killings. But his description was incoherent, something between a man and a shadow. Its eyes weren't right, he whispered to agents. They were too far apart. He passed a polygraph, but barely. Despite the circumstantial suspicion, the FBI quietly dropped him as a person of interest in late 2003. His story was unbelievable, but so was everything else about the case. Around the time of the murders, multiple residents of nearby towns reported seeing a stranger walking the back roads, tall, scruffy, wearing a long coat and wide-brimmed hat. He had no name, paid in cash, slept in abandoned hunting cabins. Some claimed he came into town for matches and canned food, then vanished. One woman, Rhonda Massey, claimed he asked her, "You ever seen a family get peeled like an apple?" before walking away laughing. The description loosely matched the figure in the trail cam photo, blurry, lantern in hand, coat dragging behind. But law enforcement was never able to identify the man. No prints, no confirmed sightings post-April 2003. It was like he drifted in just to witness something, and then disappeared into folklore. Then things got strange. Inside the Harrington barn, etched into a beam behind the hayloft, was a symbol, a triangle intersected by 3 vertical lines like claw marks. Some locals believed it to be a warding rune. Others linked it to an obscure Appalachian folk cult rumored to have existed in the early 1900s. Several pieces of circumstantial evidence fueled this theory. wax drippings in the attic, a goat carcass found ritualistically posed 3 days before the murders. June's journal entry: he wears a mask made of bark. That anonymous message to the radio station: they didn't lock the door, they thought it wouldn't find them. No evidence of an actual cult was ever found. But it didn't matter. The town began to whisper of the Watcher, a spirit that punished the sinful. Ghost stories turned into urban legend, and truth became harder to separate from fear. Perhaps the most insidious theory was the simplest. What if it wasn't a stranger at all? What if someone the family trusted, someone they let in, was responsible? This theory emerged after a forensic re-examination of the attic. No signs of forced entry. The attic window was unlatched from the inside. The food that had been eaten was prepared using family utensils, as if by someone who had done it before. The way Eliza's body had been posed, the fact that Irene had her face washed, the cup of tea still on the table. Nothing felt random. Detectives began to explore extended family, old friends, a former farmhand named Merritt LaRue, who had worked for the Harringtons in the late 90s. He'd disappeared after being fired for stealing tools, but no one could locate him, not even the DMV. It was as if he'd fallen off the map. Then came the final journal entry from June, scrawled in a corner of the book, barely legible. M came back. That entry was dated 3 days before the murders. This theory never made it into the official FBI report, but locals talked. There was a growing belief in Halverton that the Harringtons weren't murdered by a man. They were sacrificed. Stories passed down over generations spoke of a figure in the woods, something that walked like a man but left no trail, a protector of the land, or its curse, something summoned when blood was spilled on cursed soil. A Cherokee historian contacted during the investigation noted that the area once known as Black Hollow had a history of disappearances dating back to the 1800s. And buried in a forgotten newspaper article from 1910, there was this passage: family of 6, gone in the night. No signs of struggle, no tracks, only the fire still burning and the dog left behind. Locals claim a darkness moves through the pines. Different family, different time, same pattern. The FBI's official conclusion. Despite the chilling theories and eerie connections, the FBI issued a short, sterile conclusion in 2004. This case remains open and unresolved due to lack of definitive physical evidence. No suspect currently meets the evidentiary threshold for prosecution. A polite way of saying, we have no idea what happened. A good investigation should close in on the truth. This one only widened the darkness. Special Agent Rebecca Lowe. Despite the media storm, extensive manhunt, and federal resources poured into the Silent Acres case, one truth remained. Nothing made sense. The deeper the investigation went, the more disjointed the pieces became, like a puzzle with a dozen extra pieces that didn't belong to any image. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all? The killer, or killers, might not have just walked away. They may have never left. One of the most chilling details that haunts the case is the clear evidence that someone remained in the house for days after the murders. We know this because of the maintained fire, kept burning for 2 days after the estimated time of death. Used dishes in the sink, wiped but not washed. Beds that were made, not just left unrumpled but tucked in, like someone pretending everything was still normal. Livestock fed and water troughs filled. A forensic psychiatrist suggested this might point to a narcissistic delusion. The killer didn't just want to destroy the family. They wanted to become them, to live in their lives, in their silence, in their skin. Whoever stayed there wasn't hiding, they were inhabiting. One of the earliest signs something was wrong, before the murders, were the footprints found by Richard Harrington near the barn. Fresh, deep, barefoot. But what stood out? No return prints, no turn in direction, just a trail that ended in the middle of a field, as if the person vanished into thin air. After the murders, similar prints were found near Evan's trailer, also barefoot, also ending abruptly. The soil showed no signs of tampering, no dragging, no wind or rain to obscure the path, just an end. Like someone or something had stepped out of one world and back into another. Investigators noted an unusual detail while processing the house. Every door was locked. Every window was latched. From the inside, there were no signs of forced entry. So, how did the killer get in? Possibilities were floated. They were already inside when the family locked up. Someone invited them in. The attic access hatch, the one June suspected was being used, showed signs of wear, but no fingerprints. June's journal strongly suggests she heard someone moving above them for days, possibly weeks, and yet no one believed her, not even her father. This clue almost never surfaced. 3 months after the murders, while the investigation was winding down, June's old flip phone, found in a kitchen drawer, was finally unlocked. Only one saved voicemail remained, time-stamped March 27, 9:42 p.m., just hours before the suspected time of death. A child's voice. It was Clara. "Mommy, there's a man in the corner. He says not to scream." There's a pause, then a sound, a slow creak, then nothing. The line cuts out. The voicemail was deleted from police records, but someone in the coroner's office leaked it to a journalist years later. To this day, no one knows how it was recorded or why it was never reported. Inside Eliza Harrington's bedroom closet, tucked into an old shoebox, investigators found 8 letters, all unsent. Addressed to the same person, to my sister, Grace. In them, Eliza wrote about Richard's growing paranoia, footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, an old man in the woods who smiled but never spoke, and the final letter, dated just a week before the murders, which ended with, "I think Richard's right. There is something wrong here. With this land, with this house. I just hope we didn't wait too long to leave. If anything happens to us, Grace, don't come here. Don't ever come here." Investigators tracked Grace to a retirement home in Indiana. She refused to speak. She simply said, "Eliza was right. We mentioned it before, but it demands repeating." Carved into the wood behind the hayloft, only visible if you moved aside a false wall plank, was this. They knew what they buried. No tools were found on site capable of making the deep, jagged incision. No fingerprints. No explanation. What did the Harringtons bury? Nothing was ever found, at least not above ground. A researcher digging into the area's history for a podcast made a disturbing discovery in 2008. In 1910, another family, the Crosswhites, were found murdered on a farm less than a mile from what would later become Silent Acres. Same pattern: parents, children, and elderly mother. No signs of forced entry. House was clean and calm, fire still burning. Dog left alive in the root cellar. The case went cold. Their property was abandoned. It was later sold for pennies on the dollar to the Harrington family. The pattern repeated nearly a century later, as if the land had unfinished business. Some stories end, others echo. The Harringtons never really left, not in the minds of the people who keep going back. From the documentary Shadow Over Silent Acres. The murders at Silent Acres weren't just a tragedy. They became a myth. A cautionary tale whispered through the Appalachian hills, passed around online forums, dissected by podcasters, hunted by YouTubers, and transformed into a cultural touchstone in the ever-growing world of true crime. What began as a brutal family murder quickly mutated into something more enduring and more unnerving. Within days of the discovery of the bodies, national media descended on Halverton. CNN, Fox News, Dateline. Cameras lined the gravel road outside the Harrington farm, broadcasting solemn footage of the barn, the front porch, the white sheet-covered bodies being carried away. But, unlike other cases, the coverage never ended in resolution. There was no mugshot to air, no press conference declaring justice served. There was only emptiness, and that emptiness became a canvas. By the end of 2003, 3 true crime documentaries had aired segments on the case. The titles were as eerie as the events themselves: Whispers in the Barn, The Harrington House, Dead Silent, Appalachia's Forgotten Family. They drew ratings, but more than that, they drew obsession. Then came the forums. Reddit threads multiplied under r/unresolved mysteries. Armchair investigators created mind maps, reconstructed the timeline, debated handwriting samples, audio-enhanced the Clara voicemail. A subreddit, r/Silent Acres, grew to over 90,000 members by 2015. A few notable theories from the online crowd: the Harringtons were part of a doomsday cult, and the killer was a defector. Evan didn't kill his family. He saved them from something worse. The murderer was June's ex, returning under a fake identity. The attic was a surveillance den. Someone watched them for months. Users even tried to digitally reconstruct the Harrington house in 3D simulators, claiming if they could feel the layout, they'd understand what happened. But every digital breadcrumb led back to the same void. In 2021, nearly 2 decades after the murders, a TikToker under the handle @HollowEyes posted a 3-part series titled "They Never Left That House: What Really Happened to the Harrington Family." The clips went viral, over 12 million views combined. In the videos, the creator claimed to have found audio proof that Evan Harrington had been recording the attic sounds on a handheld cassette device. The audio, which sounded like footsteps and whispers, was later deemed a hoax, but it reignited interest in the case with a new, younger audience. True crime creators across platforms followed suit. Hashtags like #Silent Acres and Harrington Murders trended worldwide. The farm, long abandoned and overgrown, became a hotspot for paranormal investigators, YouTube explorers, aspiring documentary filmmakers. Some claimed to find energy anomalies. Others claimed they saw someone watching from the trees. A few were arrested for trespassing. None came away with answers. In 2023, Netflix greenlit a limited series titled Silent Acres, based on the real events. The show dramatized the Harrington family as a generational farming dynasty cursed by the sins of the land. The fictional version took liberties, turning the unknown killer into a mysterious drifter possessed by an ancient force, but it brought the story back into the mainstream. More importantly, it led to the FBI reopening a limited review of the case files, though publicly they maintained the investigation was still inactive. Privately, one agent leaked this: "We never closed it. We just stopped looking. There was nothing left to find." Halverton, once a sleepy dot on the map, is now known for one thing: murder. Locals both resent and embrace the legacy. Some sell Harrington-themed shirts to tourists. Others put up private property signs and refuse to speak about it. But you'll find it in every corner store and bar, the lingering presence, the unspeakable, the unexplainable. One diner owner put it this way: "That house, that family, it's like a stain on the map. You can paint over it all you want, but some stains bleed through." The Harrington farmhouse stood for 19 years after the murders. Windows boarded, doors nailed shut, but still intact. It was finally torn down in 2022 by order of the county, citing safety hazards. Just before demolition, a crew member found a scrap of paper wedged behind the kitchen molding. On it, written in faint pencil, were the words, "It's still here." No one knows who wrote it, but it was enough to make 2 members of the demolition team quit on the spot. The land has never been sold. It remains empty. Locals say grass doesn't grow right there anymore. We all want answers, but sometimes what's buried isn't meant to be found. Sometimes what's buried is still watching. The case of the Harrington family, what the world came to know as the Silent Acres Massacre, remains one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in American history. 6 lives taken in the quiet hills of Kentucky. No arrests, no confessions, no clear suspect, just silence, and a house that seemed to live on without them. What we know. We know the family was watched, possibly for weeks. We know the killer, whoever they were, was not in a hurry. They stayed, ate, moved carefully, deliberately. They weren't afraid. They were patient. We know June tried to warn someone, that Richard felt the land turning on them, that Clara saw something in the corner. Someone was in the attic, that someone carved those words into the barn. They knew what they buried. We know Evan came back broken, not with guilt, but with terror. And we know this story was never truly solved, just passed along, folded into whispers. What we don't know. We don't know who left the tea on the table, who tucked Clara in, who washed Irene's face. We don't know what was buried. We don't know if it was one person or many, if it was someone from town or something that came out of the woods when the fire got too low. We don't know what they saw in their final moments. We don't know what the footprints mean. We just know they ended, and no one has been the same since. True crime isn't just about blood, evidence, or justice. It's about people, about the lives that ended too soon and the stories that never got to finish. It's about what we miss, what we ignore, and what we're too afraid to say out loud. The Harringtons weren't famous. They didn't have enemies. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until they weren't. And that's why we keep coming back to their story, because deep down, we wonder if it could happen to them, out there in the woods, in their own home. What else have we overlooked? What else waits just beyond the edge of light? This has been another story from Beneath the Surface, the dark side of crime, where we explore the shadows behind the headlines and the truths that hide in plain sight. If this story gripped you, unsettled you, or left you with questions, subscribe, share, and join the conversation. We believe the past speaks, if you know how to listen. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop asking what lies beneath the surface. Like our story, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more insightful stories.